So we all know Sony Animation, the studio that brought us some of the best animated films, as well as some of the worst animated movies we've ever seen. Following up Smurfs and the Emoji Movie with the Spider-Verse is straight up diabolical. So to say they're confusing would be a massive understatement. But why? Why are they so inconsistent? And more importantly, why might that inconsistency actually be the reason they become the best animation studio in the next 5 years? There's a secret no one is talking about. Seriously. Because what I found when I started really looking into how Sony operates kind of blew my mind. See, Sony founded its animation division in 2002, but it wasn't born from a love of animation like Ghibli or Disney. Instead, Sony saw successful movies like Shrek and Monsters Inc. at the time and realized that they wanted in. The result was a studio with big ambitions but no strong creative DNA. Their first release, Open Season in 2006, which actually made a lot of money in theaters, was honestly a very mid-animated movie for kids. It wasn't until their second movie that Sony really stepped things up, releasing Surf's Up, a movie that did well at the box office, but that people also just loved because of how creative and funny it was. I mean, it was an animated mockumentary comedy film. That's unique as hell. And even though it came out after a ton of other Penguin movies like Madagascar, Happy Feet, etc., Surf's Up was able to distinguish itself and went on to earn an Oscar nomination. These early films proved Sony had technical skill and talent, they just needed to keep raising the bar. And that's where things got interesting. Because unlike Pixar, which built its identity around emotionally resonant storytelling and innovative 3D animation, or DreamWorks, which leaned into irreverent wit and pop culture, Sony didn't double down on a single style. Actually, the rule at SPA was they wouldn't adhere to any one specific visual style. Each movie would be its own universe. They kept bouncing between genres, tones, and creative leads. And while that made their output feel scattered, it also made everything unique and fun, and was the reason Sony would end up defying all expectations. But we'll touch on that in a bit. In 2009, Sony released Cloudy with Chance of Meatballs, directed by none other than Phil Lord and Chris Miller. And it was that exact lack of identity and creative vision that allowed them to experiment and flourish creatively. It was a weird, stylized comedy that took an absurd premise, food falling from the sky, and pushed it to visual and narrative extremes. When most animated movies seem to be leaning into realism as much as possible, SPA's creative flexibility allowed Phil and Chris to push the boundaries. The movie was chaotic and bursting with personality, but more than anything, it felt like the product of a very specific creative vision. And that decision turned out to be pivotal. Not only was Cloudy their most successful movie to date, critically and at the box office, it also planted a seed that maybe Sony's identity wasn't about finding a formula, but rejecting one altogether. That maybe instead of one voice, the studio could become a platform for many. This sounded like a great thing in practice, but it meant there would be many, and I mean many, flops thereafter. And that process of trying things, failing, slowly finding your creative voice kind of hit close to home, because I've been low-key doing the same thing while making these videos. Which is why I actually partnered with Skillshare to sponsor today's video, and figured it was high time to sharpen my writing skills by taking their creative writing bootcamp. I've actually been wanting to improve my writing for a while now. As someone who sucked at writing essays, getting better at storytelling so that I can get better at making videos for you all is so important to me. This specific class is genuinely taught by a great instructor. Whether you're building characters or writing dialogue, it's been an awesome class so far. Especially the section on writing with empathy, which gave me a new lens for approaching the antagonist that I frequently talk about in my videos. And I know a lot of you are writing your own stories and doing your own animations, so this is definitely worth checking out. If you don't already know, Skillshare is an online learning platform where you can learn directly from real successful creatives, from professional illustrators to renowned graphic designers and writers. writers. And the classes include everything from animation and illustration to design, writing, and so much more. The first 500 of you to use my link in the description or scan the QR code will receive 20% off your first year of Skillshare. Get started today. And you also get a 7-day free trial plus a 30-day money-back guarantee. So it's completely risk-free to try out. So you know what to do. Trust me, you will enjoy it. But now, back to those Sony flops I was mentioning. From Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs, Arthur Christmas, and Hotel Transylvania were two bright spots in a sea of mediocrity for the studio. It was hard to pinpoint what to expect from Sony in any given year, and they ended up falling victim to the sequel curse, releasing 10 goddamn sequels in 10 years from 2008 to 2018. Not only that, the Smurfs, the Angry Birds movie 2, and the Emoji Movie felt like attempts to chase trends and cash in on IP, which resulted in shit movies and made Sony quickly become the laughingstock of the entire industry. But running parallel to that was something else that nobody could have seen coming. The seeds of one of the greatest animated trilogies of all time were being planted and watered. Because while the Emoji Movie was being memed into oblivion, Lord, Miller, and the Sony executives were quietly laying the foundation for something far more ambitious. See, after proving themselves with Cloudy, they had gone on to direct the Lego Movie for Warner Brothers. A banger of a movie that reinforced just how bold their style could be and how easily they could handle legacy IP, which is not an easy thing to do. It was funny, it was meta, and it made people take their brand of storytelling seriously. I mean, hell, the Lego Movie is an animated classic at this point, and Sony took notice. So when the idea of a Spider-Man animated film was floated, something that had every reason to be a safe, kid-friendly spin-off, Sony wanted people that could push creative boundaries and handle legacy IP with proper care and ambition. So they handed it to Lord and Miller. And instead of treating it like just another superhero cash-in, they legitimately went off the rails. In fact, Amy Pascal, who had been overseeing the Spider-Man franchise, later said that the smartest thing she did was to keep quiet and stay out of their way. And so Into the Spider-Verse became the exact opposite of what people expected from Sony at the time. It was stylish, heartfelt, hilarious, and filled with a level of visual innovation that no major Western studio had attempted at that scale since Pixar in the 90s. Suddenly, Sony was leading the charge in an entirely new direction of animation, where Pixar and Disney had long prized clean, hyper-realistic CG, Spider-Verse went the opposite way. Clashing frame rates, comic book halftones, graffiti textures, hand-drawn flourishes, color-coded universes. It was a movie that looked like a living comic book, and we all absolutely adored it. It's still one of my top 5 favorite animated movies of all time. Critics raved, and animators around the world got inspired. It completely redefined what a big-budget animated film could look like, while even going on to win Best Animated Feature at the Oscars. And in doing so, it proved something critical about Sony. Their chaos and lack of uniform style was actually their recipe to success, or so they thought. But as we'll talk about later, things would start to get complicated behind the scenes. They had no house style, no overarching brand identity, no rigid playbook, and that very lack of structure became the thing that allowed the Spider-Verse to exist in the first place. If Sony had been more conservative, more uniform, or more brand conscious, that movie never would have made it past the pitch phase. Or at least it wouldn't have taken nearly as many risks as it did. So yes, Sony spent a decade shooting blanks for the most part, but all the while they were also building a culture that when paired with the right creatives could result in something magical. And after Into the Spider-Verse, everyone else started paying attention. Studios scrambled to capture that same unpredictable visual magic. Suddenly, stylization was all the craze. DreamWorks leaned into expressive, beautiful, stylized animation with The Bad Guys, Puss in Boots: The Last Wish, and The Wild Robot. Netflix pushed out Nimona, Intergalactic. Even Disney tried to do their own stylized animation with Wish, although we all know how that turned out. And while the rest of the industry was still trying to catch up, Sony had already moved on, backing The Mitchells vs. the Machines, a movie that blended heartwarming family drama with chaotic internet energy, all with another awesomely stylized animation style, becoming one of the most refreshingly original animated films in years, and earning them another Oscar nomination. It even made me cry when I watched it back in 2023, and I gave it a 4.5 stars both of the times that I watched it. Sony had found their style and creative direction, and if Into the Spider-Verse proved that taking risks could pay off, Across the Spider-Verse proved that doubling down on creative freedom, even at the cost of complete mayhem behind the scenes, could lead to greatness. Which it did. I mean, Across the Spider-Verse became the highest grossing Sony animated movie ever, and earned them their 3rd Oscar nomination in 5 years, which is insane. Sony had made it. A studio that was finally respected and considered among the upper echelon of animation. But yet, behind the scenes, something dark had been brewing for years. While Sony's outside facade was one of success, innovation, and creative risk, there were major cracks that the studio was covering up. Cracks that could threaten to undermine everything Sony had built. Because while the stylistic inconsistency and creative chaos can clearly be a recipe for greatness, it can also lead to absolute disaster. And nowhere is that clearer than behind the scenes of the Spider-Verse movies. While we were all blown away by the visuals and storytelling, the reality for the animation teams was a different story entirely. As I talked about in my previous Spider-Verse video, the production process was insanely grueling. Artists were often left in the dark about what sequences were final, entire scenes were reanimated from scratch, sometimes multiple times, and the direction? Frequently unclear, often contradictory, and constantly shifting. This was the byproduct of a studio culture that thrives on spontaneity and last-minute creative pivots, with 2 people like Chris and Phil that relish in that sort of atmosphere. Phil's grip on the film was especially tight, with Amy and other producers having a more hands-off approach, and Phil's notes and comments taking precedence over anything the director said. Compare this to how studios like Pixar and Disney operate. These movies have super large budgets, yes, but the bulk of that money and time goes into development, years of storyboarding. By the time they enter full production, the vision is usually locked. They don't waste animation on scrapped ideas because the ideas were solidified long before rendering even began. Sony, on the other hand, dove into production with many of its key ideas still evolving. This meant animators were constantly playing catch-up. One day a scene was approved, the next it was being thrown out or completely reworked. And when you're working in a medium where every second of footage requires hundreds of hours of labor, that's just a ridiculous way of working. Many of the artists who worked on Across the Spider-Verse have spoken out about the toll it took. Long hours, intense pressure, and an endless churn of revisions. The irony is, though, that this chaos produced one of the most celebrated animated films of the decade. Can a studio sustain this level of experimentation without sacrificing the well-being of its artists? That's the paradox of Sony Animation. Their inconsistency allows for radical brilliance, but left unchecked, it can just as easily lead to burnout. And yet, despite all of that, I still believe Sony is about to become the best animation studio in the next 5 years, and I'm gonna tell you why right now. Because for all its flaws, that very chaos is exactly what sets them apart. It's what allows them to take risks other studios won't, and as unpredictable as their track record may be, their upcoming slate might just be the clearest sign yet that Sony Animation is evolving, not into the most consistent studio, but maybe the most daring, and potentially the most important. What's coming next isn't just more of the same. It's weirder, riskier, more original. They're releasing K-pop Demon Hunters as we speak, a genre mashup about a girl K-pop group that moonlights as demon slayers, and although the premise is weird, the trailer looks genuinely good, and people are already praising it early on. They've got Fixed coming up, an R-rated animated comedy about a dog trying to escape his neutering appointment, by the creator and director of Samurai Jack, by the way. And this is the first R-rated animated movie by a major Western studio. They've got Black Knight, an animated fantasy epic from the same guy, a Mitchells vs. the Machines sequel, which is one of the few sequels I'm genuinely excited for. They've got an animated sports comedy movie about a goat that dreams of going pro in his favorite sport. And of course, Spider-Man Beyond the Spider-Verse, the final chapter that could cement this as the best animated trilogy of all time. But what's most exciting about all these projects is that they're mostly original stories. I mean, they have 7 original projects coming out from this point forward, and on top of that, in 2020, they stated they wanted to focus more on R-rated animated movies, which is a completely different approach to the other major studios and is so incredibly exciting. Honestly, what they're doing is so rare in today's animation landscape. Disney is leading harder than ever into sequels and remakes, and even their original stuff seems incredibly bland and safe. Pixar is kind of doing the same, with 3 out of their 5 upcoming movies being sequels. Meanwhile, Sony is completely setting themselves apart. And somehow, even with all the chaos, or maybe because of it, they're creating space for the next wave of animation innovation. So yes, Sony might still be inconsistent, they might still frustrate their artists, but if they can refine their process, improve their working conditions without neutering their creative process, and continue backing unique creative risks, I genuinely believe that they could become the studio that defines the next 5 to 10 years of animation.